Picture your phone buzzing at 6 in the morning with a headline that reads, "America moves closer to a world without cash." Overnight, 3 of the country's largest retail chains announced that their newest stores will no longer keep a cash drawer at all. A handful of state legislatures are arguing over whether businesses should be forced to keep accepting paper money. And a viral video shows a woman in Ohio being turned away from a diner because she only has $20 bills in her purse. This is not a distant science fiction future. It is closer to where the United States actually stands right now, in the middle of the fastest and strangest transformation of money in modern history. Meet Sarah Whitfield, 52 years old, who runs a small family diner just outside Dayton, Ohio. A business her parents opened in the 1980s and that she has kept alive through recessions, a pandemic, and rising food costs. For 30 years, the cash register in the corner of that diner has been the heartbeat of the business, filled every morning with coins and small bills, counted every night before the lights go off. But over the last 2 years, Sarah has watched something shift beneath her feet. Regulars who used to slide a $10 bill across the counter now tap their phones. Teenagers working the morning shift barely know how to make change. And one afternoon, a payment processor update knocks out her card reader for 4 hours, and she realizes with a jolt that more than half of her customers that day would have had no way to pay her at all if cash were gone. Sarah's story sits right in the middle of a much bigger national story because America is not fully cashless yet. But it is moving in that direction faster than most people realize. Industry researchers now estimate that by this year, more than half of American consumers will go through a typical week without touching a single dollar bill, and roughly 1 in 7 Americans will not use physical cash at all during the year. Just 3 years earlier, only about 1 in 9 consumers lived that way, which means the shift away from cash has been accelerating at a pace of nearly 8% a year. Globally, the picture is even more dramatic, with the vast majority of point-of-sale purchases now happening through cards, phones, or digital wallets, and forecasts suggesting that within the next few years, nearly 9 out of every 10 in-person purchases worldwide will be cashless. In the United States specifically, the total value flowing through digital payments crossed $3 trillion in a single year and is expected to keep climbing, while roughly 9 out of 10 Americans now use some form of digital payment regularly. Contactless tap-to-pay has become the default method for a majority of in-person card transactions in the country, driven by phones, smartwatches, and cards embedded with the same wireless chips used in transit systems. And yet, this is where Sarah's confusion and America's confusion becomes completely understandable, because the same research that shows cash disappearing also shows that the vast majority of Americans still carry some cash in their wallet at least one day out of the month. And an overwhelming majority say they want laws that guarantee businesses must keep accepting it. The United States, unlike Sweden or China, is not sprinting toward a cashless future with unified enthusiasm. It is being pulled in 2 directions at once, deeply comfortable with digital convenience while remaining stubbornly attached to the idea that cash should never fully disappear. To understand why, you have to understand what cash actually represents to different groups of people, and that is where Sarah's diner becomes a perfect window into the country's divide. Her younger customers, mostly under 45, almost never carry bills anymore, and data backs this up clearly, showing that consumers under 45 and those with higher incomes are dramatically less likely to use cash for anything. Households earning more than $150,000 a year now make the overwhelming majority of their purchases without touching a single note, sometimes using cash for less than 1% of what they buy. But Sarah also has a different kind of regular. An older man named Walt, who comes in every Tuesday and pays for his coffee and eggs with the same $10 bill routine he has followed for 2 decades, because he does not trust apps, does not own a smartphone capable of running one comfortably, and worries about outliving his ability to keep up with new technology. Walt is not alone. Nationally, several million American households remain what regulators call unbanked, meaning no one in the home has a checking or savings account of any kind, and several million more are underbanked, meaning they technically have an account but still rely heavily on check cashing services, money orders, or other costly workarounds, because the traditional banking system has never fully served them. Black and Hispanic households are represented among the unbanked and underbanked at roughly double the rate of white households, and people without a high school diploma are excluded from full banking access at a rate more than double that of college graduates. For these families, a cashless America is not a convenience story. It is a story about being locked out of ordinary life, unable to pay rent, buy groceries, or even enter certain stores if cash stops being accepted anywhere. Sarah starts paying closer attention to this tension after that 4-hour outage in her diner, when her card processor's network goes down during the lunch rush, and she watches customer after customer stare helplessly at their phones, unable to pay for meals they have already eaten. It turns out her diner's bad afternoon is part of a much larger and more frequent pattern than most people assume. Major digital payment platforms experience real outages with real consequences on a regular basis. In one widely reported incident, 2 of the country's most used peer-to-peer payment apps went down for more than an hour, generating thousands of user complaints as people were suddenly unable to send money, check balances, or complete purchases. Around the same period, a major point-of-sale and mobile payment company suffered a systems failure that left small business owners locked out of their own accounts and unable to process any sales at all for hours, a nightmare scenario for anyone running on thin margins. Even entire national payment settlement systems are not immune, as shown when a central bank's own settlement infrastructure broke down for the better part of a day, delaying hundreds of property transactions and other payments that depended on the system functioning normally. These are not hypothetical worst-case scenarios dreamed up by skeptics. They are documented, recent events, and they raise an uncomfortable question that Sarah cannot stop thinking about. If cash disappeared completely, what happens to an entire economy during the hours or days when the digital rails go down? This question is exactly what pushed one of the world's most cashless nations to hit the brakes. Sweden spent more than a decade racing toward a fully digital future, reaching a point where cash represented only a tiny sliver of retail transactions, and where the majority of citizens said they rarely touched a banknote at all. Mobile payment apps became so dominant that some banks stopped handling cash altogether, and it briefly looked like Sweden might become the first fully cashless nation on Earth. But something unexpected happened. Fraud exploded, with card-related fraud jumping by more than 40% in a single year, and scam text messages becoming so widespread that more than half the population reported receiving them, with a meaningful share of people actually falling for the trick before realizing it was fraud. Elderly residents, cut off from bank branches and unfamiliar with the apps replacing them, began describing a loss of control over their own money, some saying they felt as though the financial system had left them behind entirely. Then came a deeper, more strategic concern. Sweden's own defense ministry, worried about the country's vulnerability to cyber attacks and the growing instability of the wider world, began advising households to keep at least a week's worth of banknotes on hand at all times, treating physical cash as a form of national resilience rather than an outdated relic. By the following year, Swedish officials abandoned plans for a fully digital national currency and launched a formal government inquiry specifically focused on protecting the public's right to use cash, eventually proposing rules that would legally require stores selling essential goods and services, including groceries, pharmacies, and healthcare providers, to keep accepting it no matter how advanced the country's digital payment culture became. Sweden's central bank governor put it plainly, stating that people should always be able to pay for food, healthcare, and medicine regardless of what payment technology dominates the broader economy. Switzerland has followed a similar instinct, with a grassroots movement pushing to enshrine the right to use cash directly into the national constitution. Watching this unfold from thousands of miles away, American lawmakers appear to be absorbing the same lesson before the country ever fully commits to a cashless path. Sarah reads about a new law that took effect in New York earlier this year, making it illegal for most retail stores and food establishments to refuse cash payments or charge cash-paying customers more than everyone else, closing a loophole that had let a wave of app-only and card-only businesses lock out cash entirely. New York joins a growing list of states and cities writing similar protections into law, some dating back decades, alongside a federal bill sitting in Congress that would create a nationwide requirement forcing brick-and-mortar businesses to keep accepting cash for in-person purchases. Even a strange, very American problem has added momentum to this movement, a shortage of pennies rippling through the cash supply chain and forcing retailers to rethink how they handle small denomination payments, a reminder that even the physical mechanics of cash still matter to millions of daily transactions. At the same time, on the question of a government-issued digital dollar, the United States has taken a strikingly different road than countries like China, which has already pushed its central bank digital currency past 16 trillion yuan in cumulative transactions, or the more than 130 countries around the world now actively exploring their own versions of state-issued digital money. American lawmakers passed legislation explicitly banning the Federal Reserve from creating a retail digital dollar that ordinary citizens could hold directly, with the restriction now locked in through the end of the decade. Senior Treasury and Federal Reserve officials have publicly dismissed the idea, with one calling a central bank digital currency a sign of weakness rather than strength, and another describing it as a solution in search of a problem. The reasoning behind this resistance keeps circling back to the same word that worries Walt every time he walks into Sarah's diner: control. Critics of a government-run digital currency argue that it would hand a single institution unprecedented visibility into every payment a citizen makes, and potentially the technical ability to freeze, restrict, or monitor that spending directly, a level of financial surveillance that goes far beyond what any private card network or banking app currently allows. Instead of a central bank digital currency, the country has steered activity toward regulated private stablecoins, Dollar-backed digital tokens issued by private companies under a new federal framework signed into law last year, effectively trying to capture some benefits of digital currency innovation while keeping the issuance and control in private hands rather than a single government ledger. Whether this compromise satisfies the people worried about surveillance remains an open question, because the underlying privacy anxiety extends well beyond who ultimately issues the currency. Sarah starts noticing this anxiety directly in her own diner conversations. Every digital purchase, unlike a cash transaction, leaves a permanent, traceable record showing what was bought, when, where, and by whom, information that can be collected, stored, analyzed, and in some cases sold by banks, payment processors, and technology companies. Surveys now show that a large majority of consumers, well over 80% in some studies, say they are personally concerned about how their financial data is being collected and used. The fear is not abstract paranoia. Every tap of a card or scan of a phone builds a more detailed profile of a person's habits, health conditions inferred from pharmacy purchases, political donations, relationship status inferred from gift buying patterns, and financial vulnerability inferred from spending drops or irregular payment timing. Privacy advocates point to historical examples like financial monitoring systems used to reward compliant behavior and punish dissent in more authoritarian societies, as a warning of where unchecked financial surveillance could theoretically lead if left completely unregulated, even in a democracy. This is precisely the fear driving so much of the American resistance to a government-controlled digital currency, and it is also part of why cash retains a strange, almost symbolic importance in a country that otherwise loves new technology. Cash, for all its physical inconvenience, remains functionally anonymous. Nobody can subpoena a $20 bill's transaction history. As digital payments swallow more of daily life, that anonymity becomes rarer and, to a growing number of Americans, more valuable. Meanwhile, the security threats facing digital money are evolving just as quickly as the payment methods themselves. Financial institutions are pouring resources into artificial intelligence systems that scan transactions in real time, flagging suspicious patterns before fraud can be completed, essentially building autonomous digital security guards that never sleep. But the criminals racing against them are using the very same technology. Deepfake audio and video are now sophisticated enough to fool some voice and facial verification systems. Synthetic identities blend real and fabricated information to create fake but convincing personas capable of opening accounts or passing verification checks, and account takeover attacks have more than doubled in a single year, according to industry trackers, with global fraud losses crossing well beyond $10 billion. In response, banks are racing to deploy layered biometric defenses, combining fingerprint scans, facial recognition with liveness detection designed to catch photos or deepfake videos, voice pattern analysis, and behavioral biometrics that quietly monitor how a person types, swipes, or holds their phone, flagging anything that deviates from their normal pattern. Palm scanning technology, where a customer simply hovers a hand over a sensor to pay, has moved from science fiction demonstration to real pilot programs at banks and retailers, with some systems completing identity verification in under a second. Even after a major retail palm scanning rollout was scaled back, the underlying technology is still being tested by banks looking for faster, friction-free ways to confirm someone is really who they claim to be. All of this arms race, fraud tools against defense tools, is happening largely invisibly behind every tap, swipe, and scan that Sarah's customers make at her counter, and it captures the strange duality defining this entire moment in American financial history. On one hand, the infrastructure keeps getting faster, smarter, and more convenient. On the other, the stakes of something going wrong, whether through a hack, an outage, or policy overreach, keep getting higher. For a long time, Sarah leaned toward simply following the current, quietly phasing out her old register in favor of a sleek card reader and telling herself that cash was becoming more trouble than it was worth, since counting drawers, making bank deposits, and worrying about robbery all disappear once a business goes fully digital. The economic argument for going cashless really is compelling on paper. Handling physical currency costs businesses real money and labor, security, insurance, and time, while digital transactions settle almost instantly and leave a clean, auditable trail that simplifies accounting and tax reporting. Businesses in cash-heavy environments have historically faced higher robbery risk, and digital systems reduce that specific danger significantly, along with virtually eliminating losses from counterfeit currency. Contactless and mobile payments also tend to speed up checkout lines, something Sarah genuinely appreciates during her Saturday morning rush. But then Walt's Tuesday ritual, the 4-hour outage, the diner customers who could not pay for lunches they had already eaten, and the stories drifting over from Sweden all start to reshape her thinking. She realizes the choice in front of her, and in front of the country, was never really a binary between cash and no cash. It is about resilience, about making sure a single technical failure, policy misstep, or security breach cannot bring an entire local economy to a standstill. So Sarah does something that increasingly reflects what is happening in small businesses and state legislatures across the country. She keeps her register. She keeps a modest amount of cash on hand for emergencies, partly for Walt, partly because Ohio's own conversations about cash protection laws are starting to echo what happened in New York, and partly because she has learned that resilience beats pure efficiency when the unexpected inevitably happens. She also invests in the digital side responsibly, adding stronger authentication for her point-of-sale system, keeping a backup payment method ready in case her primary processor goes down again, and training her staff to gracefully handle both a phone tap and a wrinkled $10 bill with the same friendly efficiency. In doing so, without fully realizing it, Sarah becomes a small-scale mirror of the national debate playing out simultaneously in Congress, in state legislatures, in the Federal Reserve's internal discussions, and in living rooms across the country. The United States, at this point in history, does not appear to be racing toward the kind of total cashless society that once seemed inevitable in places like Sweden or South Korea. Instead, it seems to be settling into something more layered and more American in its contradictions, a country where digital payments dominate the vast majority of everyday transactions, where contactless tap to pay keeps climbing toward becoming the default method almost everywhere, where artificial intelligence and biometric security quietly protect billions of transactions every day, and yet where cash refuses to disappear entirely, protected by new state laws, defended by lawmakers wary of centralized financial surveillance, and kept alive by millions of people like Walt, who are not interested in trading their financial independence for a few extra seconds of convenience at checkout. Whether this balance holds depends on choices still being made right now, choices about how aggressively banks push customers away from physical branches, choices about whether Congress ever passes a nationwide cash protection law similar to New York's, choices about how transparently companies disclose what they do with the enormous troves of spending data they collect, and choices about whether biometric security keeps pace with increasingly sophisticated fraud or falls behind it. Sarah's diner is still standing, still serving coffee to Walt every Tuesday morning, and still accepting both a tapped phone and a folded bill without blinking. Her business became more resilient, not less, by refusing to fully abandon the old system while embracing the useful parts of the new one. That, more than any single statistic about transaction volume or contactless adoption rates, might be the real lesson sitting underneath America's uneasy walk toward a cashless future. Technology can absolutely make paying for things faster, safer from certain kinds of crime, and easier to track for legitimate business purposes. But it also concentrates new kinds of risk in outages, in surveillance, in fraud, and in the quiet exclusion of anyone who cannot or will not keep up with every new digital requirement. The countries and communities that seem to be handling this transition best are not the ones sprinting to eliminate cash the fastest. And they are not the ones stubbornly refusing all technological change either. They are the ones building in redundancy on purpose, keeping multiple ways to pay and be paid so that no single point of failure, whether a hacked server, a bankrupt fintech company, a natural disaster knocking out power, or a policy decision made far away in Washington, can suddenly cut off millions of ordinary people from participating in their own economy. The future of money in America is not simply a story about digital innovation replacing an outdated technology. It is a story about trust, about who controls the rails that every paycheck, rent payment, and cup of coffee eventually travels through, and about whether a society chooses genuine convenience over resilience or finds a way to hold on to both at once. There's another layer to this story that Sarah only starts to appreciate once she talks to other small business owners in her area, because the economics of going cashless are not as simple as the glossy fintech advertisements make them sound. Yes, handling paper money costs time and labor, from counting drawers at the start and end of every shift to making bank deposits and paying for armored transport or insurance in higher crime areas. And yes, digital settlement is faster and cleaner for bookkeeping. But digital payments are not free either. Every swipe, tap, or online purchase runs through a processing network that charges a percentage of the sale, often between 2 and 4%. A quiet tax on every transaction that adds up fast for a business running on thin margins like a diner selling $5 breakfasts. Sarah does the math one slow Tuesday afternoon and realizes that her card processing fees now cost her more per month than her old cash handling routine ever did, which is part of why some restaurants and shops have started adding small surcharges for card payments, a practice that is itself becoming legally restricted in states like New York, where cash-paying customers cannot be charged less than everyone else, effectively banning that kind of price gap altogether. It is a reminder that neither cash nor digital payment is inherently cheaper or safer in every situation, and that the right mix depends heavily on the type of business, its customer base, and the community it serves. The generational divide Sarah sees across her counter every day is echoed almost exactly in national survey data, where adults under 25 and adults between 35 and 44 now use cash for less than 9% of their purchases, while credit cards have become the dominant payment method for more than a third of adults in their prime working years. Debit cards, credit cards, and cash together used to make up nearly the entire picture of how Americans paid for things. But that balance has shifted dramatically over less than a decade, with cash falling from roughly a third of all transactions to under a fifth, sliding into third place behind both debit and credit cards. Small business advocates note that more than two-thirds of card transactions nationwide are now completed with a simple tap, rather than a swipe or insert, a shift driven heavily by the widespread rollout of near-field communication chips embedded in the majority of newly issued credit and debit cards, along with the explosive growth of mobile wallets on smartphones and smartwatches. Even everyday objects are starting to make payments on their own, with early versions of internet-connected refrigerators, cars, and household appliances beginning to place automatic orders and settle payments without a human tapping anything at all. A frontier that raises entirely new questions about consent, oversight, and what happens when a machine authorizes a transaction incorrectly. Sarah finds this simultaneously fascinating and unsettling, the same way many Americans do when they read about how far the automation of money has already progressed, while lawmakers are still debating basic questions about whether a digital dollar should even exist. The debate in Washington remains genuinely unresolved in a way that surprises people who assume the government already has a master plan for phasing out cash entirely. There is no such unified plan. Instead, there are competing pressures pulling in opposite directions inside the same government at the same time. Banking regulators worried about financial stability and fraud. Privacy advocates and libertarian-leaning lawmakers worried about surveillance and centralized control. Community banks and credit unions worried about being squeezed out by giant technology platforms entering the payments business. And consumer advocates worried most of all about the millions of unbanked and underbanked Americans who could be left behind if cash access keeps shrinking faster than banking access expands to replace it. Sarah's own state representative, she learns, has co-sponsored a bill modeled closely on New York's cash protection law, and versions of similar legislation are moving through committee hearings in California, Oregon, and Illinois, suggesting that whatever direction the country ultimately settles into, it will likely be shaped state by state, rather than through one sweeping federal mandate anytime soon. That patchwork approach frustrates some business owners who would prefer one consistent national rule. But it also means the debate stays alive and visible, argued out in state houses where ordinary people like Sarah can actually show up, testify, and be heard, rather than being decided quietly behind closed doors at a single federal agency. Perhaps the most important thing Sarah takes away from all of this, after months of watching her own diner sit at the crossroads of an entire national transformation, is that the story of cash in America is not actually a story about technology at all. Not really. It is a story about power, about who gets to decide how money moves, who gets left out when systems change too fast, and who bears the cost when convenience is prioritized over resilience. It is a story about trust between citizens and the institutions that hold their money, trust that gets tested every time an app goes down during a lunch rush, or every time a customer's data ends up somewhere they never expected it to go. As Sarah locks up her diner one evening, register drawer counted, phone charged for tomorrow's contactless payments, she does not know exactly how this national story ends. Whether cash will keep shrinking toward a small, protected niche the way it has in parts of Scandinavia, or whether some future shock, a major outage, a data breach, a geopolitical crisis, will send the country swinging back toward physical currency the way Sweden itself did after learning the hard way. She thinks about Walt, who will be at his usual table again next Tuesday morning with the same worn $10 bill folded in his shirt pocket, and she thinks about the college students who come in on weekends and would be genuinely confused if she asked them to pay with cash at all. Two completely different relationships with money existing comfortably under the same roof because she refused to force everyone into a single system built for only one kind of customer. She thinks about the diner's insurance agent who mentioned almost in passing that robbery-related claims for cash-heavy businesses in her county have dropped noticeably over the past several years as more transactions move to digital rails. A small but real safety benefit she does not want to dismiss even as she keeps her own drawer stocked. She thinks about the article she read describing how counterfeit currency losses across the country have fallen as digital payments absorbed more of the transaction volume, freeing up law enforcement resources that used to be spent chasing fake bills. None of these benefits are imaginary, and none of them make her regret modernizing her point-of-sale system or accepting a tapped phone as readily as a swiped card. But none of them either convince her that the answer is to eliminate the older system entirely just because a newer one works well for most people most of the time. The businesses and communities that seem to be navigating this transition most successfully, from what she has read and seen firsthand, are the ones treating it as an evolution rather than a replacement, adding new capabilities without demolishing the old ones, building redundancy the same way a good electrician wires a backup generator into a house instead of betting everything on one power line that might go down in a storm. Money, in the end, is simply a tool people use to trust each other enough to trade. And any tool that stops working for a meaningful share of the population, whether because of a technical failure, a privacy fear, or a simple lack of access, has failed at its most basic job, no matter how sophisticated or fast it is. That is the quiet lesson sitting behind every statistic about contactless adoption rates and every headline about a new digital currency law, whether anyone in Washington is ready to say it plainly or not. What she does know is that the choice to keep both options alive in her own small business, however old-fashioned it might look to some of her younger customers tapping their phones, has already paid off more than once. And in a country still arguing about what money should look like in the decades ahead, keeping that choice alive for as many people as possible might be the most important decision anyone, from a diner owner in Ohio to a lawmaker in Washington, can make right now.